I found Ann on Twitter. I've had a couple questions like, how did you find her? But there's a lot of interesting discussions that take place. A lot of academics are on Twitter, but not everybody follows academic. But there was a discussion one day, and I can't even remember what it was about, but Ann engaged in that discussion and mentioned a small book she'd written about young women in the workplace and how to have conversations with colleagues. And Ann and I, O'Connell, we have a mentoring group, and our group has read that book the last few months, and I've found a lot of good advice in it. But there's a lot of topics that could be covered, but we're going to focus on creating allies today, and we can address other topics when you come back. So thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Okay, now the talk is written for an hour, but with a lot of questions, and I say at the beginning of all these talks, and mean it, that nothing I can say is as important as anything you can ask. So I'm counting on you not to be shy. So the structure of today's talk is roughly like this. I'm going to talk about what you and how your training has influenced how you approach workplaces. I'm going to talk a little bit about workplaces today and the particular pressures they put on people. And then I'm going to talk about models for how we can interact with each other and suggest a couple models, namely collegiality and allyship. And then the part of the talk that people really want to get to, which is how do we make this happen? And that's what the parts about moving the needle are about. So, first of all, about you and your training. So you guys are all here because you have succeeded on the academic path. And you were given places in college and grad school and your postdoc and your jobs based mostly on your own work. And the results of your work depend mostly on you. And that's how you get evaluated and recommended. You're here now, you're sitting in this auditorium because you have succeeded within that framework. Now, the workplace is going to be different in some significant ways. The results of your work depend much, much more on other people than it did during your training. Because when you got a grade, when you were being trained at any level of school, it was your grade. Now, this means that you are going to be evaluated much more in the context of your colleagues than you were during your training. So, how you interact with individual colleagues and how you work in teams, it's going to be a much bigger part of your job, and it's going to matter much more to your career than it did during your training. This is actually one of the hardest things for people who spend a long time getting their education and then move into the workforce. It's one of the hardest things for them to deal with, this transition to when they are not evaluated only on their own work. Now, a lot of what the rest of this talk is about is that you bring habits from your training to the workplace. And that's not a good or a bad thing, that's just a thing, right? It's necessary and it has consequences that I want you to be aware of. Now, some things are going on in workplaces currently that are going to influence how you behave there. This is one of the things that I think does not get enough play. Women occupy more roles and more visible roles and more sensitive roles than they have ever before. And we all saw during the 2016 election how people reacted to there being a woman presidential candidate, and some of the comments sent her way. I have had students who have wanted to enter the infantry combat arms of the armed forces and were not allowed to do so, but now young women are allowed to do so. Not everyone behaved stunningly well about those changes. And then there's Me Too, right? Women calling out how they have been sexually harassed or sexually abused. And one of the things that I think is important about this is that, you know, it started out in places, Harvey Weinstein, what a pig. And then it's kept going on to the point where this is not about a bad individual, right? This is about some kind of structural imbalance because this is happening in every profession, right? When it's one or two people in the same profession, or even 10 or 20 people in the same profession, you can say, whoa, what's going on in entertainment, or what's going on in technology? But we're now at the point where it does seem to be everywhere. Now, another thing that is changing is that technology and social media have made it not possible much anymore to say, oh, don't worry, that's not what happened, that's just what she's saying, right? So cell phones are now ubiquitous. You must assume that interactions are being recorded. The internet does not forget, right? Nothing is lost forever. And this is an important thing. Social media have accelerated the speed with which information travels, and the acceleration is itself speeding up. I had lunch with an extremely interesting group of women today who talked about their sons and daughters and dealing with the spread of social media and how shocked they were at the pace of it. And you know, these were folks younger than my generation. These were folks who grew up with technology, right? The pace is getting faster. Now, in that context, here's some other things that are going on. This is maybe the single most important thing I can tell you about women in the workplace. For men, valued workplace traits and valued social traits tend to be the same, right? Aggressive, confident, asking for things, all that stuff. For women, valued social traits and valued workplace traits are in general misaligned. So when we ask women to behave a certain way in the workplace, that's not how we value them behaving socially, and vice versa. So women, but not men, are always negotiating this tension between how they should behave socially and how they should behave in the workplace. And they're always feeling like they have to adjust one way or another. And again, this is a thing to be aware of rather than a good or a bad thing. I have views about whether this is good or bad, but what I want to say for this group is just that it is happening. Okay, now, the actual workplace. Here's the question for today. So in the context of workplaces, where you get evaluated more in the context of your colleagues than you have, more than in your training certainly, and in the context of Me Too, how should we treat each other at work? And why? And how do we do it to give ourselves the best chance of flourishing in the workplace? And why should we do that? So far I have set the context, and now what I want to make are some suggestions. Now, I assume that the way you think about interacting with people looks something like this. There are relationships that show a relative imbalance of authority. So when we grow up, right, we have parents, we have teachers, we have coaches, we have our first employers, eventually we have a supervisor, we have a PI. All of us get comfortable interacting with superiors. And we may not use the word superior, but that's what it is. Now, there are also relationships that show a relative balance of authority, or at least more balance, right? There's roommates, there's friends, there's dating, there's romantic partners, and you know, for whatever balance of workload happens in those relationships, the assumption is that there is a greater balance of authority there. Now, here I want to suggest are two ways of thinking about relationships that can help you at work. One of them is colleagues, and the other is allies. And what I find so interesting about these two concepts is that they are potentially independent of authority. That is to say, you can have these relations of collegiality and allyship with a senior person, or with a much more junior person, or with a peer. And that's one of the reasons they're so useful. So, first, colleagues and collegiality. I am here to tell you, I am 57 years old, you will work with a lot of people over time, and you're going to like some of them, and you're not going to like some of them. Collegiality, though, means that you treat everybody well, and that's whether you're friends or not. It means you treat them independently of any personal attribute, whether they share your religion or your race or your political views or anything like that. Collegiality says that you treat them well. It also means assuming that everyone has something to contribute at work, no matter what their role is. And it also means treating everyone at work well, no matter what their relation to you is, right? We all know the kind of person who is a good colleague to their boss and a crummy colleague to everybody junior to them, right? And this is not, I hope, about being that person, right? That is not what collegiality is. But this is what I understand collegiality to be. Now, sadly, the data show us that collegiality is an ideal, and it's not always achieved. Certainly there is Me Too. There is a persistent gender pay gap. The talk ratio, this website, arementalkingtoomuch.com, is excellent, and there are lots of studies that show that when women talk 20% of the time, they are perceived as having talked 50% of the time. And when women talk 50% of the time, they are perceived as having talked 90% of the time. It's quite extraordinary. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to bring this citation. One of the things that most appalls me when I come, and I'll give that in the PDF of the slides I send you, is the disparity in funding labs when men and women start out. And the funding disparity is quite significant. It's up to 20%. It's extraordinary. It's horrible. Really, really persistent gender disparities at senior positions in organization and on their boards, and persistent gender disparities in government organizations. So here's the deal. That previous slide where I talked about collegiality, every time I give a talk about it at an organization like this, everybody nods, right? Because they sort of know what collegiality is and they value it and they say, yeah, that's what it means to be collegial. And it's a very widely shared ideal. So I guess my question is, since it's such a widely shared ideal, why does this crap happen, right? And much more to the point, what can we do about it, right? Which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So one of the ways that we can start to change how stuff happens in the workplace is this concept of allyship. So I want to talk about what that is. You get broader workplace collegiality when you engage people as allies, and our goal is workplace equity. So allyship starts out by believing that what other people say is true, right? You imagine yourself in other people's position as they describe them. I cannot believe that it is 2019 and still one of the most radical things a man can do is believe that what a woman says is true. But it is. So allyship at work. It means you don't respond when a colleague says, oh my God, X happened, by saying, well, that didn't happen to me. It's like, oh, and that is relevant how? Right? The first response is by asking, what can I do to help? And listening to the answer. In other words, all of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about is about foregrounding the other person's experience rather than your own. Allyship at work means recognizing that not everybody starts out from the same place. It means elevating voices and experience other than your own. There are people in the workplace who are disadvantaged. I saw this. I was managing a very large group right after 9/11, and I had more than a couple employees who wore hijab, and all of a sudden they had a much harder time making their voice heard, and they were much less comfortable speaking up. And it is really, really important to recognize who is going to have a harder time speaking up and why, and elevating those voices. And I'll have some suggestions about how to do that. Allyship also means recognizing that perceptions categorize people, and allies respond by challenging those perceptions. I spent 13 years at Amazon, or as we said, 13 holidays. And when young women came in to the workforce, many of them, to my great shame, heard, "You don't look like an engineer." And I don't know about you, but if I had joined as an engineer at a big internet company, the first thing I would want to hear out of somebody's mouth is not, "You don't look like an engineer." But perceptions categorize people, and it's important that you realize that, and to be an ally to challenge those perceptions, right? Now, here's the part of the talk that people are always most interested in. How do we get there, right? I've told you what I think the landscape is. I've told you that to get to better collegiality, we have to have allyship. And now I am going to talk about how to actually do that, and then I'll take questions. The first slide is what women can do to help ourselves. And this is always in the talk where I say, gender is not something that only women have. And so saying that this is a problem that women are going to solve if they just behave differently or something is clearly ridiculous. But nonetheless, there are things that I think women can do with and for each other that are helpful. One of the things they can do is identify each other. Every time I come to a university, particularly a big one like this that has lots of different divisions and lots of different people, I always hear women say to each other, "I had no idea you did that," right? "Really? I didn't even know there was like a whole department that did that." And it's incredibly important that women know where other women are in the university and that they reach out to each other. So when you guys hear somebody say, "Oh my God, I feel like I am the only person in that building, it's so creepy," that you can say, "Oh, you know, so-and-so is in that lab in the floor right below you," right? That kind of thing helps other people not feel isolated, and it is a very powerful counter. Elevate each other. So this is perhaps my most famous example. In the Obama cabinet and among his senior staff, women were quite disturbed to find that despite the progressive views of gender by that president, that they were not taken as seriously as their male colleagues. So they came up with a series of things to do to elevate each other's voices. And what they did was they said, in meetings, they said things like, "Let's hear what Anne has to say." Or somebody said, "You know, Mary always has really good ideas about that foreign policy area. Let's ask her." In other words, they took it on themselves to identify what other women were good at and to elevate those voices and to call them out. That is an extraordinarily powerful thing you can do just by learning who your colleagues are and just by talking about them. Okay, this is advice that sometimes people find a little bit uncomfortable. You need to tell each other what is going on, positive and negative, about money, about power, and about abuses. When I was a junior faculty member at the University of Michigan, I started a program where in the English department we invited new faculty to dinner and had a potluck, and the junior faculty put it on for them. And they came in and we sat them down and we said, "If you get in the elevator and you think Professor so-and-so is looking down your shirt, you're right. Don't be freaked out about it. It is not just you, and it is not your fault." And the important thing about these conversations is that what they do is they show other women that it is not just them. And it gets them ahead out of the "what did I do wrong" conversation. And it enables people to move forward to solutions more quickly. It is incredibly important that you talk to each other. At the University of Michigan, where I was a public employee of the state of Michigan, my salary was published every year. And I had to say, it completely wigged me out. The first 2 years I was there, I really felt like I was not wearing financial underwear. I mean, it was just creepy. But then, every year, there was a designated faculty member on the salary committee in the English department. And so eventually, you know, I was the next crow on the fence pole, and so I was on the committee. And what I realized then was that Michigan was better than usual, not good and not perfect, was better than usual at having a smaller pay gap between men and women. And one of the reasons it did is that the data were public, and it was possible to shame people. Public data always help the disadvantaged. You should push for public data in every way possible, in every state possible, every fact possible. You should circulate data among each other. You know, obviously, there's a lot of crummy data on the internet, and you have to make sure that it's real. But when you find out stuff, you need to tell each other. Because operating in isolation is what makes other people not know, you know what, you're paid 20% less and you're doing 30% more work. Here is a phenomenon that senior women have to watch out for. It's called suck it up, because it used to be worse. One of the things that I hear from junior women a lot is a huge amount of frustration about, I went to so-and-so, senior woman in my department, and I said, oh my God, X is a problem. And what she said to me was, well, you should be grateful, because when I started out, there wasn't even any maternity leave. Senior women, this is not helpful. And the phenomenon I want to call out is this. It is possible for things to be better in general, as they are now, right? Women faculty, maternity leave, better health care policies, and still not be equal. And it is possible for any individual woman, especially any individual young woman, to struggle to address that. The fact is, people say different things to senior and junior women, right? And senior women may forget the kind of rude and dismissive comments that people say to junior women that they don't say to senior women anymore. Nobody questions my right anymore to do what I do, and if they do, I make them into ectoplasm, right? But honestly, I can do that because I'm 57 years old and I know how to do that, right? People don't say that to me anymore, but people say that to young women all the time. There was a recent thread on Twitter where a senior woman said to women researchers, particularly in the sciences, tell me the most dismissive thing anybody has ever said to you. And you shouldn't read it right after lunch. But what was immediately clear was almost all of these remarks were made to these women when they were junior, because they were perceived as vulnerable and they were perceived as the kind of person to whom you could say that. And it's incredibly important that senior women remember that junior women are in that position and that they are not. Engage with each other's careers. If you do all of this stuff above, you're already going to be doing this. But if you see like a note goes around about a fellowship and you know, like, I'm not applying for that, I'm way too busy. But forward it to somebody, right? If you think they're on leave and they might not have seen it, or you think they might not know about that good talk where somebody comes to do a mentoring thing, invite them. Help each other. This is not a zero-sum game. When we all do better, we all do better. Now, that was for women dealing with each other. Now I'm going to talk about how to create allies, and this is for both women and men. So this is hard. You have to realize that not everybody is going to be or is going to become an ally. And you need to cull the herd, right? The marketers tell us that when you're trying to gain customers, you're going to have three kinds of people, right? Those who are your customers, those who are never going to be your customers because they're loyal to some other brand or whatever it is, and those who are potentials. And what you have to do is you have to identify the potentials. If there is somebody who is really bad about his women colleagues and who seems not to show any signs of improvement, I beg you, please stop bashing your head against the wall. Now, I'm about to contradict myself with my next piece of advice, but never mind. You really have to identify key influencers, and you have to explain to them what you need them to do to support women. So you need to tell them that story about the Obama administration, like, here's how people elevate women's voices, right? Could you help me do that in this upcoming traumatic meeting, right? Here's what we need to do to get more women into this profession. When you're on the graduate admissions committee, could you say, why did we have a class last year of only 1 woman and 19 guys, right? You need to let people know what they need to do to become allies. And this stuff is more important when it comes from the influencers. So it's really important to identify who they are in any given situation. Now, if the influencers, and this is where these 2 bullets contradict each other, if the influencers are the same people who are never going to change, then what you have to do is you have to identify the most powerful person who is likely to change. And sometimes you are in a position of doing the next best thing. Now, here is a hard thing, and this is where I say again, gender is not something that only women have. When you identify key influencers, you need to explain what you need them to do to educate men, right? We all saw the famous Super Bowl ad with Gillette and, about bringing up boys and so on and so forth. But if you have, for example, one person who is always difficult in a meeting and always puts down women and always talks over women, it will be much more helpful if it is a guy saying to them, let's hear what Ann has to say. Or, please don't interrupt Mary. Let's let her get to the end of the sentence. This is valuable. There are some things that women only hear from women, and some things women only hear from men. And there are some things men only hear from men, and some things men only hear from women. But we have to get men's voices engaged much more than we have in creating equitable workplaces. This is one thing that is just really, really helpful. Advocate for early stage bias training at the outset of graduate programs. There's a number of really helpful studies about this, including some from my home institution, from Yale's engineering departments. And it shows that putting men and women together in situations early in their graduate programs and then talking to them about the implicit bias in those situations helps them later on. It helps retain women in the program, and it helps them succeed. Reward the behavior you want to see. So when you ask an influencer and that influencer says, could you please let Ann finish a sentence? Then what you want to say is after the meeting, thank you for saying that. I don't know, I don't expect universities have changed a whole heck of a lot since I last taught full-time in them, but one of the things that we don't do is say thank you enough. It's possible to shock someone simply by saying thank you, and I encourage you to shock them. And here's the other thing, what I said about the junior women. I want you to realize that it is possible to have both incredible local difficulties in the context of progress. And so when people say things like, oh my God, but it's so much better now, it's possible for it still to be really hard for somebody. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Okay. Now, this is a pitch I am going to make, and then I'm going to stop and take questions. You got to vote. If you're a citizen, this country's laws and policies are made by elected officials at every level. You must register and you must vote in every election forever. I also want to encourage everyone here to run for office. We don't have enough science-trained people. We don't have enough science-friendly people who run for office. The book to read is by Amanda Littman. It is called Run for Something, and it is about how important it is for you to run for things at every level. because if we're going to see good change, we have to make that change happen. Okay, so I have some suggested reading, but the thing I want to do now is take questions. Here's where we are in workplaces. How do we get better?
So, Amy, we brought you in to talk about gender, but I know in your bio that you consult with companies on other issues of disparities in power or disadvantaged groups as well. So how did the ideas you have translate to other power differences? Or what's the same and what's different?
So the question is, how do the ideas I talk about gender translate to other disempowered groups as well? So the reason I started out with gender are that we are the biggest group that is actually a majority to be considered a minority, which is, insane. But one of the things and one of the reasons that I encourage women to do many of these things is that there, in fact, is strength in numbers. And when people realize all the stuff we do and how many of us there are, behavior tends to change slowly. Now, in populations that are more of a majority, it is much, much harder. The statistics about, from psychology tell us that it takes women to get to, or it takes any minority population to get to about 20% before the really adverse behavior stops. So sometimes what we have is a situation where a group can never get to 20%. And so, for example, you think of the recent rise in anti-Semitism, you think of the recent anti-Muslim behavior, you think of the way police forces have adversely treated black people, especially black men, right? And if in fact the baseline is 20% and those groups are not at 20%, then the question is how we are going to protect them and drive to equality for them. And that's where what I talk about largely is persuasion, right? And that is something that particularly educated people are really good at. For other groups, the difficulty is when this has to turn into policy and law. And sadly, I think that's what has to happen for people who need more protection than numbers can provide. And one of the reasons that I come to groups like this, and I always say out loud, you must vote, is when people need protection, we have to be sure it is there. And by the way, I am under no illusion that having legal protection is going to be enough, but it is something. I chair the board of directors of Lambda Legal, and so I know the limits of law, but I also know what happens when you don't have the laws. And it is worse not to have them. It is no panacea to have them. Yes?
You might notice there are more women in this room than men, which is really fine to see, don't get me wrong. But this is about gender, not necessarily women.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how you can encourage participation of the other side of gender when we offer opportunities like this, but you come to the table here.
That's right. The way you do that is you do the way, and the question was, how do you encourage participation by the gender is not something only women have crowd. And the way this happens, and this is why I talk about allyship and why it's so important, is that you have to, it is going to be, sadly and stupidly, it is going to be on women very often to do the reaching out. But that's why allyship has to be a position of, will you help me with this? Not, will you change your behavior because you're a caveman and I hate it, right? Which is really not an effective strategy of reaching out or marketing. But will you help me? Here is the kind of help I need. Will you help me do it? And once that happens, once women start reaching out like that, the reason I advise people to cull the herd, honestly, and to focus on the people who can help them make change, is that actually once that change starts, like once you get like the number of guys who are seated here now, and once you get the people reaching out, the dinosaurs feel themselves identified as dinosaurs even subtly. Now, they may not care, right? And that is obviously their privilege. But the reaching out, especially the initial reach out, is going to be on women. But reaching out from a position of allyship is a way of making yourself more likely to be successful. And that's why I recommend what I recommend.
Question.
Yes.
Where do you see the workforce in, let's say, for the next generation? Is there going to be an actual change? You know, the Me Too movement and other movements that are coming up. I mean, are we ever going to see this gap, this, this gap in payment and support, and is it ever going to be our time?
I think the answer is yes. And here's the reason I think that. I have seen extraordinary changes in my lifetime. Not enough and not to equality. So I was born in 1961, and the great legislative, particularly, changes of my lifetime have been, the change that allowed, for example, women to buy contraception without approval from a husband. Think about that one. Changes to control one's own fertility, the ability to open a checking account in your own name, which was not always allowed. I mean, when you think back to what women used to not be able to do, my niece accuses me of making it up. And I'm like, no, I didn't make it up. That's ridiculous. So here's why I'm optimistic. I think that all of these waves of change are preceded by pushback. And I think the stronger the pushback, the more that means the underlying change is strong. And so the pushback, for example, to the first black president, right? Unbelievably strong. But honestly, the toothpaste is not coming out of the tube. And the reason I am optimistic, I will say, is the younger generation. And I'll give you an example of that. My godchildren, when they were 18 and 14, my late wife and I went to talk to them, and we were talking to them about don't ask, don't tell. And so they said, so, and it was being repealed then. And so they said, so, Ann, like, what's going on? So we described the repeal of don't ask, don't tell to them, and they looked at me, and because they were well brought up children, they did not say what they were thinking, which is that old people are stupid. Because it did not occur to them that would be a problem, right? And so what I am seeing is a younger generation that is not having it, that is incredibly social media savvy, and is deeply, deeply unshy about saying what it wants. So when I hear, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doing things like, you should be shocked, paying her interns, right? Because she knows what it was like not to be able to take a non-paying job. When I see senior people in Congress pushing back on this first-term congresswoman, what is wrong with you, right? That's when I feel optimistic. But yeah, I think it's going to be hard. Am I going to see it in my lifetime? No, I don't think so. Is there going to be progress? Yes. Yes.
So whether you're a male or female or whatever gender you identify with, and you're in a leadership type of role, and you have, let's say, somebody who is not using the correct language, is doing whatever kind of negative behavior, when do you feel is the best or most appropriate time to correct? Would you say in that group setting or privately? Or?
So the classic HR advice is always praise in public, criticize in private. And that advice is pretty good. What you want to do, and what is often hard to do, is to get to the criticism as soon as possible after it happens. Because one of the things that I have observed about bad behavior in workplaces is if you're not conscious of it enough that you're actually doing something bad or you don't care, you may not even remember it. So what you have to do is you have to take somebody aside as quickly as possible. Like, so you have a meeting where somebody is constantly talking over, right? And what you have to do is you have to take them aside right after the meeting, and you have to say, you know what? You didn't let Ann complete a sentence. Here's the deal. She had the great idea. She had this floor. Do that. Or, hey, I know Ann has a high-pitched voice. That has no relation to her ideas, right? Don't make fun of her high-pitched voice. Or, you know what? Be careful how you talk about people's clothes, right? Because if you compliment a woman's low-cut blouse, right, that talks about how you evaluate women in that context. So the thing that is really, really important is to privately call out brief behavior. Then the thing you have to do, and this is harder, is that you have to be accountable, right? There has to be an I don't want to say escalating because it sounds unnecessarily violent, but you have to, the next time, because behavior does not change right away, right? You have to say, you know what, 2 meetings ago we talked about this, right? You talked over her again. Let's talk about how you're not going to do this next time, right? And there has to be trackable accountability for the behavior. But the old rule of criticize in private and praise in public is the best rule. Yes?
On a similar topic, so latent in this, in the workplace at least, is junior and senior level. So if you're a junior man and you see a behavior that is inappropriate in your opinion from a senior man,
Right.
how do you challenge it without coming off as disruptive?
Right. Exactly. Or as an annoying millennial that the senior person can ignore just because you're an annoying millennial. That's right. Notice the nifty no-win situation there where there can be no improvement. So this is where the influencer thing is critical. In my experience, particularly in universities where I grew up, I'm a faculty brat, what you have to do is you have to identify a peer of that person, because they are not going to hear it from you, most likely. There's a few situations where it works, where, you can, like on your way out the door, you can say, did you hear what he called her? Right? And sometimes those little subtle signals work. Mostly they don't, but sometimes they do. But what you have to do is you have to identify who will that person listen to. Sometimes the answer is no one. And if the answer is no one, and he has just been, pardon me, a shit to someone, then your job, what you can productively do, is you can go up to whoever it was and say, I'm so sorry. I don't necessarily think that behavior was right at all. Is there something I can do? Right? Not, so sorry it's never going to change, but I just wanted to pat you on the back. But again, the whole allyship thing of, is there something I can do? Right? That is always acceptable. But the way any of this changes is that a peer of the person doing the inappropriate thing has to be the one to address it with them. Because that's usually what works, if anything works. Yes?
So as junior faculty or someone who comes in as a new person, often, when you start interacting with other faculty members, sometimes you hear that, yeah, this person is like that with everyone, and don't think that this is you. So how should you address problems like that?
That's right. So on the one hand, don't think it is just you is actually helpful, because it stops the whole self-blame cycle, and that's why I had that group of junior faculty over and why we said what we said. But what that cannot be is the end of the conversation. Because honestly, I am completely done with hearing he's like that to everybody. It's like, awesome. Now what are we going to do about it, right? Because he's like that to everybody, boys will be boys, all of those things that excuse behavior, at the very least, the behavior has to be addressed. So this is where I would give you the faculty version of the advice to a student or to staff, which is to say, find out two things. Who in your department you can raise this with, right? Because many, many people are not going to be sympathetic, right? But you want to find the person in the department to whom you can say, so-and-so said X. I found that really offensive. It may not be somebody in your department. You know, when I was on that faculty salary committee and somebody referred to a woman faculty member as a bitch, it was clear that I was not going to be able, as the only woman and only junior person in that group, you know, I went to a woman faculty member, you know, and she helped me strategize how to talk about it. But it is going to be about finding someone to whom you can say, I found this behavior offensive, here's the behavior, what do you think can be productively done about it? And again, it is about gradually ring fencing inappropriate behavior and getting it pointed out. The tricky thing is finding the right person to point it out. In the situation you described, it is almost never going to be you. You know? And this is where there is advice that I will convey rather than endorse, which is that people say, wait till you get tenure, right? Wait till you get tenure because then you can speak up. And the reason I cannot endorse that advice is that very often the kinds of things people are on the receiving end help them not get tenure, right? It drives them out of the profession, or it discourages them in their department, or it makes them hate their working environment, or, you know, whatever it is. So it is about identifying the bad behavior, and it is about finding the people to influence it. I find that an unsatisfying answer, and I'm sorry I don't have a better one. Yes?
How you mentioned earlier about the different types of relationships that we've all gone through in our lives and experiences. How do you advise or approach or encourage us to approach if we see someone approaching allyship, kind of like keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer kind of relationship creation for whatever projections they have in their vision or their goals?
So I want to be sure I understand your question. If you believe that they are setting up a circle of friends and then also identifying a circle of enemies, if they're dividing the world into sheep and goats, in other words, is that the problem?
That kind of way, or they're using it as a resource just for the short term to get to a certain.
Oh, yes. Transactional friendship. Yes. How should I put this delicately? Those kind of people tend to reveal themselves pretty clearly. And what you have just said to me suggests that you can identify that. So what I think about that is that, first of all, that behavior is sadly common. Second of all, that you can identify it. And third of all, you know, maybe don't have them over for pizza, or, you know, because they sound like assholes. But here's the other thing, right? To the extent that you are in a position to say, he is just using whatever it is, that is behavior you can decide to emulate or not. But it actually doesn't have to change your behavior, right? Because the fact that somebody is behaving in these sort of toxic ways and creating the in and out crowd and so on and so forth is not behavior you have to engage in. Because the way behavior cycles like that get power is when people play along. And that is what you have to resist doing. And that's where I think allyship reveals itself as actually very powerful. So yeah, but they only get power if you play. Yes?
In your research and in your years of experience talking about allyship and collegiality, have you found that sometimes women act against other women? And how do you combat that type of behavior?
Oh yeah, it's gross. Yeah, they do it all the time. And this is a syndrome called there can only be one, right? This is what happens when a woman succeeds and believes that there is a zero-sum game and that if she has succeeded, it means another woman will be threatening to her. So that's one thing. But the second thing is that it is a subcategory of behavior that is actually much more general, which is that there is a senior person who sees a bunch of, young junior people who come along and who seem really smart, and they use this weird new thing called Twitter, and I don't even know what that is, and I'm a little wigged out by it. So it happens a lot. It's really gross. That's why I have that line up there about the syndrome of, well, it used to be much worse, so just deal with it. What I would say about that is that this is where you must quickly identify a peer of that person and ask them. Now, the intervention is often not helpful here because what the person is doing is protecting her own turf, right? And that's the problem. And if they are not secure enough in their own position about their own turf, they are likely not going to be secure enough, certainly not to hear it from a junior person, right? Like a woman who behaves like that to a junior person is not going to hear it, right? So you can talk to them. This is the one time I have had success. After I was denied tenure at Michigan, I had a deeply unpleasant experience with a senior woman like that. And having been denied tenure and having nothing left to lose, right? I went to this person and said, I don't know if you realize it, but when you said X, this is what I heard. And she actually said, I had no idea I was heard that way. It was like, really? You said you thought I should do X and you didn't realize that you said I thought I should do X? That's nuts. But that happens a lot. It happens a lot, sadly. And a lot of it is being threatened, and it is this zero-sum game. Yes?
When you talked about moving the needle, you gave several suggestions which were great about things we can do to change our behavior, interactions we can have with peers to change behavior, calling behavior out ourselves or going to others that can do that. And we know that if we think about things from an ecological perspective, that we can see change at a much higher level if we're all acting together as a collective to do those things. Are there recommendations that men and women together who want to see these changes take place can really move the needle even more so in addition to those individual and peer interactions?
First of all, thank you for closing the door. Here's what I think about that. I think it is effective to ask an entity like a university to take the issue seriously, to provide opportunities for mentorship, to understand that the tenure clock or whatever it is needs to slow down for childbearing or, those. It is important to work on structural things and get things in place to remove the disadvantages women face. That is something that can be done group to group and institutionally, and that is a core responsibility of senior people, right? There are some things that senior people must do because they are empowered to do it, and there is no excuse for them not doing it. Now, as for it moving change faster, I'm not so sure it does, because first of all, nobody likes change. And second of all, nobody likes being told that it's their behavior that needs to change as opposed to someone else's behavior, which is clearly worse. But here's what I think about this. One of the reasons that I focus on behavior is that when the conversations come down to you're a sexist pig, right, which is about what's in someone's head, that is both not correctable and not helpful to hear. But you can say, please don't call me bitch. Please do not refer to any of my female colleagues as a bitch. I actually do not care what is in anyone's head. I care what comes out of their mouth. And so when they say, I didn't mean anything by it, right? There's this standard way that people say an offensive thing and say, oh, I was just kidding. I don't care, right? Because I am all about optimizing for behavior changes that make workplaces places where we can all bring our best selves freely and fully. So I guess I think that it's up to the institution and for all of us to work for institutions that create structures that are better for everybody. But when it comes down to individual changes, this is what I have found effective at an individual level. Because I do not care what they think. I only care what they say and how they treat people. Yes?
I appreciate your comments on intersectionality and allyship in the workplace, but we're all, either faculty or, higher educated people already at this point in this room. But the problem starts much earlier in the leaky pipeline in, elementary school. What can we do for future generations to help them not experience these things? I mean, at this point, we're all very privileged to be at the point that we're at. So
Totally.
we know what we can do with, for the people who we're mentoring on a daily basis, but what about the younger folks?
So what can we do with our privilege? And how will we get it so that my nephew Teddy will not be in this room in 20 years having the same conversation? Absolutely. You can vote. I mean, it is really an undervalued weapon about making change. You can help put the people in office. You can be one of those people. You should read Amanda Littman's book, Run for Something, because that's where the policies come from, right? So that's one thing. You can support initiatives for nonviolent interpersonal interaction, and you can ask that schools, particularly schools where you have children, have such things, right? I mean, and there are all kinds of these incredibly innovative programs. I just read one about a prison in, I think it was San Clemente, that is working on hula, teaching inmates to do hula and describe their history sort of self-reflectively and the good effect it's having on recidivism, right? You can work, one of the most effective things you can do is you can work on teaching the notion of consent in middle school, both for how women receive it and how girls receive it and how boys interact it. I think that, when I'm getting back to your question about why I think I'm optimistic, one of the things is that I am really glad that the notion of consent is being elevated in ways it hasn't in the past. And it's because the notion of consent and violent control are antithetical that I think you can focus on that. But the single most important piece of advice I would give you is to vote and run for something. We have to be that person. It's 4 o'clock. I want to say that often I have been an academic, and often the absolute hardest thing to find in academics is an hour. You have given me an hour. You have been generous with your time and attention, and I'm very grateful. Thank you.
UTMB Health, working together to work wonders.